Well, welcome again to Royal Route 66, our march through the Old Testament books. And we're looking to lessons that we can learn that solidify our walk with God and allow us to focus on His blessings each day of our lives. And today we come to the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is probably best known for the idea of dry bones in a valley. There are several spirituals that have been written about Ezekiel and having the dry bones come back to life. But there's much more to this prophecy in the Old Testament. In fact, Ezekiel deals with the most important questions of life, then and now. God is present with us, or has He abandoned us? That's the question that Ezekiel first asked. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem and marched the leaders, including King Jehoiakim and the priests, the 800 to 1,000 miles, different parts of Babylon, and he brought them all back to his kingdom. And even then, the Israelites were deluded that their sin and disobedience to God would destroy the Babylonians and make things right again. But that's not what happened. They suffered. They were imprisoned. Many of them were beaten. Some of them were thrown in the lion's den, others in the furnace of fire. So you have tests that come in the lives of the people as the prophet Ezekiel tells the truth about God. He taught them, though, that God is present when they are obedient and faithful with a matchless blessing in their lives. But when they're disobedient, adulterous, disloyal, and rebellious, God's presence with that condition brings judgment and punishment for the people. Ezekiel was one of those taken into captivity. During the time that he was in captivity, he lived apparently in a house along the river Kilgore, which is near the city of Nippur in Babylon. If you were to be there today, it would be the nation of Iran. And during that time, he had a certain amount of freedom because he was considered to be one of the king's favored folks who came back or came in the destruction of Jerusalem. In Ezekiel, we see that because God is compassionate and merciful, His presence with us, as it was with Israel, means forgiveness, hope, salvation, and restoration. And all of those things are always possible through the blessing of God. But when we refuse to do God's will and to live in God's way, then we're left in terms of the possibility of judgment in our lives. Interestingly, when you look back and find out what the name Ezekiel means, it is God will strengthen. Can you imagine how that must have felt to the people who were in bondage and who wondered if God had forsaken them? Here comes along a man who's going to share the promise of God, and his name means God will strengthen. You're not going to be left in weakness. You're not going to be left in bondage. You're not going to be totally destroyed. Ezekiel comes along to say, God will strengthen you. God will save you. God will bless you. And we find that reflected in the book of Ezekiel. Chapters 1 to 3, you have the experience of Ezekiel's call to be the prophet of God. In chapters 4 to 24, a long section, you have his preaching of the coming destruction and captivity of Judah. A reminder, Judah and Benjamin are the two tribes that were formed in the south around the city of Jerusalem. The northern kingdom, after Solomon with his son Jeroboam, was in the northern section of Israel and centered around the city of Samaria. Ezekiel also reminds the people in chapters 25 to 32 that God is going to judge the other nations around them. And that finally, when you look at chapter 33 to chapter 48, you're going to see the restoration of God's people. Only the visions of Daniel and John are as intense as those in Ezekiel. So if you want to look at apocalyptic literature, that is predictions of the future and the coming judgment of God, you're going to look at Daniel, you're going to look at Ezekiel, and you're going to look at the book of Revelation. These are all cataclysmic descriptions of the judgment that God is going to bring on the world. A judgment from which his people will be spared because of his promises and because of the redemption of Christ at the cross, but the judgment which will come on those who have rejected God and who have refused to follow his way. So Ezekiel is a book with a key vision for the future, even when it appears that you and I may be exiled and living in a land of failure and judgment. God is going to bring us hope in the midst of all that we're suffering. You and I may look at our world today and say, wow, where are we going? There are things that are being said and things that are being done and things that are being threatened to the Church of Christ and to the family of God. And we often wonder, where is God in the midst of all this? And Ezekiel would thunder back, God is there, even if you have to find him in a valley of dry bones where there seems to be no life. The Spirit of God will give life to those bones and bring resurrection to those who trust him. The key verse in the book of Ezekiel is chapter 36, verse 27. And you and I need to hear this verse, especially today. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will keep my judgments and do them. The promise of God is not, you're not going to go through any difficulty, you're not going to go through suffering, but the promise is, in spite of all that, when I put my spirit in you and you begin to walk and learn how to be obedient to God, then I'm going to bring you peace and I'm going to bring you redemption and I'm going to allow you to be my people blessed by my spirit. The key action then that comes in the book of Ezekiel we can describe by saying we have to speak God's word to our generation, whether they're near or whether they're hearing, or whether they refuse to hear. It would be nice, wouldn't it, that every time you shared something about God's love, people would listen and respond and say, oh, thank you. But that's not the case. Ezekiel reminds us, no, you can say God is love, God is merciful, God is going to redeem us, and people are going to say, oh yeah, Ezekiel, you're a crazy old prophet. We're not going to pay any attention to you. And maybe that's the way people respond to you sometimes. But you and I have the opportunity of sharing the message of God's love and God's grace and God's redemption. And when we do, there will be some who will respond to that good news and allow God to bless them and use their lives for his glory. When I think about Ezekiel, I think about the kind of prayer he must have prayed as he looked at the weariness of the people, at the captivity and the hopelessness that they felt. And he said in his prayer, Lord, allow me to stand in the gap. Let me be the answer to a need. Ezekiel could not be a priest in Jerusalem any longer, but he became a prophet in Babylon. Could God be moving you from someplace you're comfortable to someplace you're uncomfortable and calling you to do a new task? Ezekiel had that experience, and why should we not expect that God will look at our lives and say, I have a new assignment for you. I want you to serve in this place rather than in this place. Allow God to lead you and guide you, and you, like Ezekiel, will experience his blessings. Only when we trust the Lord can we look beyond the immediate and see the eternal. The tyranny of the urgent or suffering can keep us mired in the circumstances of life, but God's next move is above the circumstances. I remember the words of Corrie ten Boom, one of the wonderful Holocaust survivors, and she said, whenever God closes a door, he opens a window. So if you're feeling discouraged today, you're feeling like you live in a valley of dry bones, remember, God has a plan. And if it looks like the doors are all closed, look up. There may be a window opening for new service, new blessing, new opportunity for your life. Ezekiel has many wonderful things to teach us when we come to his book. I hope you'll take the time to read it and learn from it and be blessed by it today.